Okay, besser so. Okay. I guess I was not the only one who had troubles finding the room. Then I will start. I'm going to talk about entities. My name is Sascha Grossenbacher, based here on Drupal.org. I guess many of you have seen or heard about me. I maintain the entity system in Drupal core. I also maintain many Drupal contributed modules. I work at Entity Systems in Switzerland, and I have a bit of a warning first. My session was switched around. It's basically written for a longer slot, so I might take a bit longer than the official schedule is set for. But hopefully we still are in time for the closing session, the closing event afterwards. Topics. I'm going to do a quick introduction of terminology, the basic API around entities, then content entities, fields, and type data, how that all plays together, how that works, revisions, content moderation, content translation, and the combination of revisions and translations. The storage topic I will probably skip a bit to not spend too much time, and then displaying entities, a little bit of twig stuff, and so on. And at the end, bundle classes. I gave the same presentation about 1 year ago in Switzerland in Mountain Camp. Back then, they were super new in Drupal 9.3 introduced. Now it's already a year, but I will still include them at the end. I think they're quite neat if you haven't used them before. So, terminology. An entity type is, well, a certain type of entities. They're typically used also as a variable name if you have the entity type definition. And examples for that are the node entity type or content in the UI. It's also a bit confusing. Terms, users, but also configuration things like user roles, views, and so on. Then we have an entity, which is typically a single entity that you load from the database that you create, that you work with. Then there are two big kinds of entity types in Drupal core. One is content entities, which, for example, are nodes, users, files, and terms. They are stored in a database, they have fields, they have a fairly complex structure, but it's always the same. So if you know one entity type, you can work with all of them. On the other side, we have config entity types. Those are stored in configuration. So all the stuff you can do with configuration, like importing, exporting, diffing, you can do with them as well. They usually work with plain data, plain arrays there, and they're mostly different, so they don't share too much between themselves. So you have user roles, vocabularies, node types, blocks, and views as examples. Blocks here is the block placement, and not the custom block that, again, is a content entity. Then we have handlers. Handlers are a separate extensible system that allows to attach functionality to entities. So we, for example, have storage, we have access, we have forums, viewing, and user integration. Those are all handlers. The nice thing is that there can be a default implementation for each entity type, and you can customize it for your specific entity type if you need to. And other modules can also add additional handlers, but that's not that often used. Then bundles are kind of a weird word, but they're basically subtypes of content entity types. So you have different variations or subtypes or bundles of the same entity type. They share a bunch of fields, and then they have additional different fields. So for example, for nodes, we have node type. For terms, you have the vocabulary. For media, you have media type. Not all entity types have bundles. For example, user and files in Drupal core don't have bundles. They're just one version of them. They can still have fields, for example, for the user entity, but they also cannot, at least not expose them in the user face like the file entity. Then below content entities sits a concept called type data. And that's a very generic API to describe data and data structures. So you have typically lists and data objects and entities and all the related objects, the field and so on, I will get to that, are type data, or you can get a type data object from it. Often you don't see too much of that. It can be useful for very generic code like validation that is able to work with all kinds of entities. And there are two common things, or three common things with type data. There are primitives, which are like strings and dates and very simple values, basically. There are lists, which is n items of a certain type. They all have the same definition, but there are multiple values of them. And then there are complex data, which is kind of like an array. So you have array keys, and each key can be something different, which again, the contents of them are again type data. Then I will get back to those topics. The basic API, nothing special here. I guess if you did a little bit of work with entities in the past, you've seen that. You typically get a storage handler for your entity type. And based on that, you can create new entities. There is a method on the storage, and often there are methods, static methods or object methods on the entity object itself. If you use dependency injection, use the entity storage. If you have static code, a hook or so, it's also okay to just use the static method. You load them, you can do a single load or multiple load, very basic stuff. And if you make changes or create a new one, at the end you save it, and you can also delete them in the same way. Then one powerful feature is entity query that basically abstracts the actual storage and makes it easier or more generic to query for certain entities matching certain conditions. Same thing here, you can get a query object from the storage, or you can do the Drupal entity query static method. You can do conditions. It's very similar to database queries. You have in conditions, you have equal, and so on. The only difference there really is that like doesn't exist. Instead, there is start Swiss and end Swiss special types of operations. But other than that, it's, if you know SQL query builder, entity query is mostly the same. One difference is that for content entities, you can do joins. So in this example, let's say we're querying nodes, and then we want to have nodes where the author of that node has the role administrator. So you can own the UID field through the entity property, join the user, and then match its conditions. So you could do a condition that the email matches a certain pattern. You can only do this on content entities. You can also do entity queries on config entities, but you cannot combine it. You cannot do a config entity, a content entity query, and then do a join on a config entity and match a property there. You cannot mix it like that. That's not supported. One thing that you might have seen now as well, Drupal 10 made it required to explicitly define access. Before, it defaulted to checking access. Now we have to explicitly define and think about if your query needs to do an access check or not. That means if your results are being displayed to users, you want to do access checks. If you have a cron job, if you have an update function, then you don't want to do access checks. Or you might miss some entities because it's running as an anonymous user. You can do the usual stuff with sorting, you can do range, you can do a pager, nothing too special here. And at the end, you execute that query, and then you get back a list of IDs. You can load them, you can work with them. One useful bit, the array keys or revision IDs, which is useful if you do an all revision query. Then you can use the array keys to load those specific revisions and even match the same entity multiple times, for example. So you can get all revisions of the same entity. If you have an entity, there are a few very basic common methods. You can get the ID from it, the label, all of them implement the method. Very few entities might not have a label, but the method always exists. You can get the UID, again, not required. The method exists, it might return nothing, but you can always rely on it, the method to exist if you have any entity. You can convert it to an array. I usually just use this when I debug stuff. So in the debugger, I can do entity to array, and then have a very simple, nice representation of the values in my entity, and I don't need to go deep into weird properties to look at what I'm working with. Entities typically have URLs attached to them. The most common one is canonical, which is the place where you view that entity. Content entities typically have that, not all of them. Config entities often don't have this. You get the URL object, you can turn it to a string or an array to use it in your twig template or somewhere else. The same as link. You can also get the link object directly from it with a configurable title and the so-called view template. Sorry, no, the link template. If you do generic code like this, make sure that you check if the entity has the link template that you want to work with. Again, not all of them have it. For example, paragraphs and comments don't have a canonical URL. So if you write generic code, make sure you check for this. Then access. When you work with entities, you often need to check if the user has access to view them, to edit them, to delete them. So you call the method. There is one version that returns a Boolean, true or false. You can also do the third argument to true. Then you get one of those access result objects back, which you can check with is allowed, and you can use it for caching if you cache the result of what you're doing with that. You can also check access to fields. So you can check if a user is allowed to see a certain field. The difference is that entity access is by default denied, so you need to allow it. And field access defaults to allowed, so you need to deny access if you want a certain field not to be accessible. Usually you only see the difference when you implement access hooks. Create access exists too. Typically you don't have an entity that you work with, so you need to call the access control handler from the entity manager and call create access on that. There are methods for the bundle and options there as well. And very quickly, you customize access to entities that are not your own using hooks, and you then, or in your access control handler, and then you need to create access result objects. They have 3 states: allowed, neutral, and forbidden. Simply put, access is allowed if at least one person says allowed and nobody says forbidden. So if you want to always deny access, do forbidden. If you don't care, neutral. If you want to allow, allowed. Then hooks, if you want to react to entities being saved, change them, then there are a lot of them. The CRUD stuff is pre-save and then insert or update. So pre-save is always called before the entity is saved. If you want to change it, if you want to generate the title, for example, then use pre-save. Note that the entity might not have been saved yet. It might be new. It might not have an ID. If you do stuff after, then you have insert or update to work with. On update, you have the special original property. So if you want to check, for example, if the entity has been published before and no longer is, you can compare that. Or if the label changed, for example, you can use the original property. And you can also use entity-specific hooks. So all of these also always exist. So if you want to work just with nodes, you can do hook node pre-save, and then node need to check the entity type on them. Okay, so next topic would be content entities. A content entity is a container of fields. There is typically nothing in there except fields for values. A field then is a list-based type data concept of field items, and the field item is again a container of properties. see more examples of that on the next slide. And then properties are just raw type data. They're strings, integers, but also objects like a date object or a language object, or they're references to another entity. So from interfaces, we have the entity, which is content entity interface, and then you get a type data object. You rarely need that, but you can do that. The field then is a field item list interface. It extends from type data list, and the field item extends from complex data. And then the properties, as mentioned, they're just directly type data stuff. Field types are plugins. You define the class that is the field item, and then you define the properties, the children of the data that you contain, and you can also do a list class, but that's not too often used. What's more interesting and more often used is working with that data. So the fully expanded complete version is this line. You have an entity, you get the field, you get the first item, you get the property you want to work with, and you get its value. You can simplify that with array access. So instead of get 0, you can do an array access, and you can simplify it quite a bit more with the magic get method. So you can access the property, which is the same as get property, get value. And the delta 0 is the default. So the shortest version that you can go with is basically this: get the field, get the property, which gives you the value of the first item. Many fields don't only have a single delta. Setting values is the same. Again, the full version, you get the field, you get the delta, you get the property, you set the value. The simplified version with magic set, you just assign a value to the property. You can also use the set method on the entity. So you can set just a value to a certain field. That's the main property, the only property if it has multiple properties, like the text with format, where you need to provide a value and a format, you can pass an array, value and format. You can also provide multiple values. So if you have an array with strings as keys, it's assumed to be multiple properties of a single item. If you have numeric keys, as in this example, you set multiple values. You can also append an extra item next to the field and keep the existing ones unchanged. One confusing thing is the get value method. I will get back to that even a bit more. If you call it on a property, as you've seen, it returns a value of that. So for example, a string. If it's this is the user roles, and when you call it on the field item on delta 0, you get an array of all the properties in there. And if you call it on one level up, then you get an array of all the field items and their properties. So these two look very similar. The one we've seen before with the value property, but they're completely different. So you don't need this one too much. One common useful case is that you use the array column function to basically get all the target ID values from multiple field items at the same time. Then you don't need to do a loop and collect them. You can do it in a single line. By the way, I will also put the slides link. They're online, so you can look up those code samples. You don't have to remember everything here. I know I'm going through it quite fast. You can do loops. You can loop over all fields of an entity, which is not that common, but what's very common is you loop over multiple values of the same entity. Suggestion on naming: when you work with this, always use $item or something item to make a difference between the field item and the values it contains, like the entity. Don't do field as entity or something. Do item or field name item or something like this. It helps to understand the code. Field definitions. There are two interfaces when you need this stuff when you define your own fields in code. When you work generic, for example, if you want to do something with all entity reference fields on your entity type on any entity, then you need to work with definitions. There are two things. There's a storage definition, which contains storage relevant settings, and it's for entity type level. and there's a field definition which has values that can be different on different bundles of identity. For example, the body field can be required on pages and can be optional on articles, and kind of a different label. Base fields are fields that are defined in code that always exist. So for nodes, that's the title, that's changed and created, that's the author, stuff like this. They're defined as base fields. What's special about them is that because they exist on all bundles, always, they implement both interfaces. But if you have compared with configurable fields, there you have two different concepts. Both are config entities. You have field storage config and you have field config, both implementing the specific interface. And when you have an entity, then you can get those definitions using get field definitions. You can get a specific one for a given field name. You can also get it from the field object. So if say maybe you just get a field object, maybe you are inside the field object, then you can just do get field definition. And from the field definition, you can get the field storage definition. You can also access field definitions if you don't have an entity. That's the entity field manager. And it has two relevant methods for most cases. That's get field storage definitions. You pass the entity type like node. And you have field definitions where you pass the entity type and the bundle, like for example, node and article. Some special things and weird things about entity API. As mentioned, that value stuff. So you have the value property. That's the same as get with the per argument value and get value because it's using magic get to get that property out. And as we saw before, get value the method is something very different. It's similar for entity, not too fast. The entity reference fields have an entity property. That's the role in this example. And they have a get entity method that refers to the parent entity. So if you do get entity, you get the user instead. That's especially weird in Twig, because if you do access the entity property in Twig and it's not set, Twig will nicely, helpfully fall back to get entity, and then you get the user back. So if you do user.roles.entity, you always get the value back, even if there's nothing set. This is very confusing, but naming things is hard, and backwards compatibility is also making it hard to improve this. One more thing, magic get and set also exists on the entity level, but I would generally recommend against using that. It's mostly there for historic reasons because we needed backwards compatibility when upgrading Drupal 7 core to Drupal 8. Avoid using it in general. There are some exceptions, and that's non-field special properties like original, like view, that only exist like this. We are working on improvements around this, but it might still take some time for that to happen. Then revisions and content moderation. So content entities can be revisionable. Each entity always has a default revision. And when you save an entity, you can choose to save it as a new revision. And then your new revision can be the default revision or not, and then becomes a pending draft, a pending forward revision. That's the related methods. You will see an example of how that looks in a second. So you can get the revision ID of an entity. When saving, you have is default revision was and is latest revision to check what you're working with. To save a new non-default revision, you say set new revision true and is default revision false, and then you save. When you do this, what's happening is, next slide, sorry. Content moderation is then basically just the UI for it. So revisions exist in Drupal core in the entity system. Content moderation gives you a user interface to do this in the UI. And the workspaces is a different approach for content moderation. You always just have a single entity that you work with. And these workspaces, you can create a workspace, create a bunch of notes or change them, add drafts, and then review it and then publish all together. but the underlying system is the same as far as a single entity is concerned. Same storage, same behavior. And when you do what I showed before on the example graph, then you get basically this. We have 4 revisions, revision 1 to 4, revision 1 and 2 are past revisions, and then revision 3 is the current default revision, and revision 4 is the pending forward revision that you can only preview but not yet see as an anonymous user. So far, fairly easy. It gets a bit more complicated when you add translations to the mix. Content entities can also be translatable. Similar, a content entity has a default translation. You can add translations and remove them. And you can control per field if they should be translatable or if they should have the same value for all translations. Again, API stuff is fairly basic. You can get the language to check the current language. You can check if it has a translation. You can get the translation. You can add a translation, and you can remove it again. When you work with code, when you want to get the translation, I recommend always using the get translation from context method from the entity repository. This will check access. This will check if a translation exists. If you do get translation on a non-existing translation, you get an exception. And this will always return something. It might not be the German translation, but you have an entity that you can work with, that you can continue. So where it gets a bit more complicated is when you combine translations and revisions on the same entity type. What's special and a bit confusing at first is that each revision contains all languages. So the user interface makes it look like you just work on one language, but in the backend, in the storage, always all of them exist. Revisions tag when languages change, and then you merge them together again when you have drafts and merge them together again. It's copying the values of just the translation, applying them, saving a new revision. That's visible here. So we expanded a bit our example. We now have 2 extra revisions, that's 5 and 6. Both of them add a new language. So in revision 5, we have French. On revision 6, we have Italian. The current published version doesn't know anything about this. If you look at the note on the website, it's just English and German in this case. Then when you publish them, what's happening is that it takes the current default revision, it does a diff basically of the translation values, applies that on top of it, and create a new revision. So in this example, we have a few more revisions. We did one more update of the Italian translation first, revision 7. And then we published the English, the changed forward draft with the English and German. Then we published the French version, which creates the next revision. That would be revision 9 at this point. And after that, we publish the Italian translation as well. And then we have revision 10 that contains all 4 languages. As you can see, revision 9 didn't know anything about Italian yet, because it's based on the current default revision and not the latest revision. Yes, there are just one last note on this. There are some quite confusing behaviors about this. When you create a new draft, you change fields, for example, it's paragraphs, or maybe also a layer builder, then and add a translation, saved as a draft, add a translation, then you will not see those draft changes. That means you cannot do a draft, translate it, publish it all together. That's quite annoying in many cases, but it's very hard to change and fix or improve. As mentioned, the storage topic I'm skipping. It's just going a bit into details on how the storage works, what tables you have. If you're interested, you can look it up. There are a bunch of tables in here and data, and basically this explains how it looks when you have those cases, when you have translations and revisions, what's stored in each table. So skipping this, displaying entities. Again, we have a handler for this. That's entity view builder. So when you want to view an entity, use the entity view builder. That gives you back a render array, and that goes through the regular run the process of converting that intent to an HTML string. There's a two-step process, as mentioned. There's viewing and building the entity, which is calling the formatter stuff. So each field has a formatter assigned for the given view mode and view display that you chose to display it as. That's stored in the view displays for, again, a config entity. And then usually, typically, you have twig templates to display your entity and each of those fields inside. The API for this looks like this, not too often used directly. You get the view builder handler, you view the entity and tell it in which view mode you want it to be rendered and built. You can also render specific fields. So if you for some reason just want to view the rendered body, you can view that. There are two options. One is you pass in a configured view mode, or if you don't want to rely on configuration, you can also pass in an array of the exact configuration how you want it to be. So in this case, we don't want to have a label. We have no settings when you use the formatter. When you're not sure what to pass, what you can do is configure it in the UI and then have a look at the exported, saved view display configuration. You can basically take that YAML definition, put it right in here. And then I mentioned view modes and view displays a few times. They're also sometimes a bit confusing to understand. A view mode, like a field storage, is defined on an entity type. So node always has a teaser view mode. And then you have a view display, where you say, for the article node type, I want to display this field like this and this field like that on the manage display page. And they might exist or not for a given mode, for a given bundle. And if it doesn't exist, it will fall back to the default view display, which typically always exists or is built on demand if necessary. Twig is unfortunately not very standardized. So each entity type needs to do its own pre-process and preparing data. That's why it's also sometimes a bit annoying to work with that, because there's no generic default implementation for theme suggestions. Some entity types have it, some don't. Some name variables differently, which can be quite confusing as a front-end person, as someone who's doing template customizations. What you can do, what helps, is you can look for a function called template preprocess entity type, like node or taxonomy term, and then you can look at what is being defined there. For example, typically, as we can see on the next one, if you look at node, we have the suggestions, which you probably used before for the view mode, for the bundle, and the combination of bundle and view mode by default. And then you have the content, which is the render arrays of each field, and you have the node, which is the entity object, which can be useful to check values, conditions. If a certain checkbox is checked, then do this or the other thing. Commerce, for some reason, does it differently. For commerce, for example, commerce order is the same as content, and then you have commerce order entity, which is the entity object. But you can, if you don't find it, if it doesn't work, look up the template preprocess function. Then to display fields in Twig, the basic version is fairly simple. It's just do content.field name. If you do all of content as well, then you need to exclude it there with the without keyword. So if you want to have one field up in the header and the rest down below, you need to exclude that field later on. What's quite useful and what I use often is to just print delta 0 of a certain field, because that skips the field template. So those extra two divs with a bunch of classes or non-classes, depending on your theme, can be quite annoying. They're often in the way. So the simplest way is to just add .0 at the end, and then you don't have them. One limitation that, of course, only works if you have just a single value and not a multi-value field. So if there's 1 and 2 and 3 as well, you need to find a slightly different solution for this. To check field values. So for example, if you want to check if a certain field has a value and then wrap it in an H2, you can, it's easier to use the node object. So you do node.field.value, which is mapping quite nicely to the PHP code as well that you've seen before. And then you can render it out inside an H2 tag. A bit like entity queries, a bit like PHP as well, you can also join. So let's say in this example, we have our nodes, they have a category taxonomy term. And on there, you have a highlight field. And if its highlight is set, it should be displayed as a strong text. And if not, it shouldn't be. So we can do node.the name of the field, entity, which is the reference property, and then the name of the term and its value. And if that is true, it will return it in strong. And if that's false, it will not. That's using node is typically much easier to read than using content and then in there finding the value and so on. Okay, so last topic, bundle classes. If you haven't heard about those, as mentioned, they were introduced in Drupal 9.3, so fairly new. And what it allows you to do is put your business logic in a class. So you might have some logic that you often use and use that on articles, for example. Then you can define your own custom class that extends from nodes. That's important for articles. And when you load a node of type article, it's an article object, and you can call your method on it. In Rush 11 and newer, you have a generator, so you can generate such classes and the hook you need automatically. The length change record is there, and I also have a quick example. So in this case, using the same example with the highlight category again, but in this case, I created my own basic page class. I have a highlight category in there, doing the same thing as before, just in PHP. It's going to the reference taxonomy term, checking its value. Then I need to tell Drupal to use this class. For that, I need to use the hook entity bundle info alter hook and check if page is there. If yes, set the class to my class. And what this allows me to do is, for example, in Twig, I can change from the before example, that is this very long hard-coded stuff with multiple dots and so on, to just node has highlight category. There are lots of very nice things you can do with this. I think if you do something just once, it's probably not worth adding a class, the hook, and so on. But you have a long-term project where you have lots of business logic. If you want to maintain it, update it in the future, maybe you will at some point change the logic around that field highlight. And then you can say, change it in a single place, and you don't have to update 20 different Twig templates and custom code and pre-process and whatnot. So all your reused shared code can live in a single class. There's also a country module that I think adds more features on top of that. I don't have the link in there, but I will update it and include that as well. That's basically it. You can find more information about the Entity API on the Drupal org docs and API documentation. Most of the slides earlier, many slides also have direct links to specific topics. If you want to know more about a certain element, then you can look it up there. Okay. And then going back to the first slide, there's the link. Questions? Yes, I guess so. Input overload. Yes.
Hello. I have a question about the future.